Welcome to today's talk by Peter Drahos called Public Lies and Public Goods, 10 Lessons from When Patents and Pandemics Meet. I'm Sarah Bannerman, Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair of Communication, Policy and Governance at McMaster University. McMaster is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee First Nations in the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And today's talk is taking place in McMaster's third-year course on intellectual property. And in this class, we've talked about the ways that Western intellectual property law and the colonial and settler governments that have established it throughout many parts of the world have erased Indigenous law and legal traditions, including those dealing with scientific knowledge and culture, and also the ways they've facilitated the taking of Indigenous knowledge and culture. At the same time, we've also seen movements by Indigenous peoples to reestablish ownership and knowledge about Indigenous law, legal traditions, and culture and language. I want to thank Dean Sweat and the Global Nexus for their support in organizing this talk, including Chandrima Chakrabarty, Jerry Wright, and Don Bodish. Peter Drahos is a professor at the European University Institute, and he was my postdoctoral supervisor at the Australian National University. He's well known for his many books, including A Philosophy of Intellectual Property, Global Business Regulation, which he wrote with John Braithwaite, which has been cited thousands of times and is used as a core text around the world. Information Feudalism, which changed the way that many people looked at how intellectual property rules are made, revealing the role of lobbyists. The book Regulatory Theory, which he edited, and his most recent book, Survival Governance, which has based on more than 250 interviews in 17 countries and charts a path forward for turning climate change around. Professor Drahos does not balk at major challenges. He proposes ways through for citizens and for governments to kind of propose the strategies and the insights needed to chart those courses and to meet the major challenges of our time. Today, we turn to the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. The context of today's talk is the failure of the global community, the pharmaceutical industry or international institutions, the IP system, to make medicines and vaccines equitably available worldwide. The Director General of the World Health Organization noted in 2021 that 75% of vaccines have been administered in just 10 countries. Today's talk also comes in the context of exciting new developments in vaccine technologies, including an exciting inhalable vaccine at McMaster University. Universities in some cases are taking the lead. The University of Ottawa is leading a pandemic preparedness hub to help produce vaccines in partnership with McMaster. So a question for today is, how can universities ensure that the next vaccine is equitably distributed worldwide? Peter Drahos notes in his article that underlies today's talk, the title of which is Public Lies and Public Goods. He notes that pandemics turn us into globally networked communities of shared fate, where the failure to distribute treatments or cures to one community in the network creates a weak link, another opportunity for a pathogen to play for a win in evolution's replication game. He argues that patents generate huge risk when it comes to pandemic management because they may allow, he says, response times of states to a pandemic threat to be affected by a patent monopolist. For today's talk, I want to ask, how can universities ensure that the next vaccine is equitably distributed worldwide? What should be the role of universities involved in pandemic innovation and production? How should universities navigate the needs to commercialize and scale up vaccine technologies, to fund their own operations, and then also the importance, the primary importance of equitable global distribution of vaccine technologies at speed. Welcome, Professor Drahos.
And Jerry, if you're there, Jerry Wright is the executive director of McMaster's Global Nexus for Pandemics and Biological Threats. And he's a professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Biomedical Sciences. So Professor Wright, I wonder if you might say a few words.
Sure, Sarah, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Professor Drahos, for agreeing to provide this talk today. Just a note for those of you who don't know about the Global Nexus Initiative here at McMaster, we're trying very hard to bring together researchers and scholars from across disciplines so we can learn from each other and really understand how we can address big challenges like the ones that we've just been living through. I totally agree with Peter in the sentiment that it would be nice to put it behind us, but as the reality is I think we're the echoes of it, and then maybe even some additional challenges we'll be feeling them in the future. So we really have to learn from the past experience and find ways to learn from each other and really understand how, to bring together biomedical researchers, clinicians, historians, humanists, and social scientists and engineers to really try and understand and bring us together so we can start to learn each other's language and learn from each other. So really happy to have helped sponsor this opportunity here. And Sarah, thank you for putting it on, and I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. And Peter, why don't I leave it off to you now?
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah, both for setting the scene and for such a warm welcome. I indeed feel very much among friends zooming into Canada, where an awful lot of exciting research has been done on intellectual property and the kind of related big problems, big picture issues that intellectual property raises. I don't actually have a PowerPoint to share. I just got tired of PowerPoint at some point. So I'm just going to talk for 20 or so minutes, and then I hope that we'll have a discussion. I'd just like to set the context of my public lies and public goods paper. It's very much actually in the spirit that Professor Jerry Wainwright talked about, which is it's trying to extract lessons or learnings from the last 30 years of our experience with patents and pandemics. By way of background, I, in the 1990s, did a lot of work on access to medicines, and then in the decade that followed, I slowly sort of did less and less work on patents and pandemics. I mean, essentially what happened was that in the 1990s, there were very few scholars working in this area, and then essentially a sort of younger and much smarter generation than me sort of got involved. The pandemic really made me sort of look backwards and try and think about, in a fairly concentrated way, what have been the lessons about patents and pandemics, and really, two kinds of systems are meeting here. I mean, physical scientists, natural scientists know all about the complexity of the physical world. But social scientists know something about the complexity of the social world, and lawyers know something about the complexity of the world of rules. And essentially what you have in the patent system is one form of complexity, a high degree of rule complexity meeting physical complexity. And unfortunately, as my talk is going to illustrate, things don't go well for us as a species when we bump up against systems that scale exponentially. So much as the International Panel on Climate Change predicted in its reports, pandemic threats seem to be increasing. So if we think back to the first 2 decades of this century, we had SARS, we had H5N1, avian influenza. We had H1N1, which is swine flu. We've had numerous cases of Ebola, and we also had MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And of course, then we had COVID. So if you think about it, the first 20 years has been really packed with pandemic threat and a pandemic materialising. And this again goes to Professor Wright's point that very probably the next pandemic is maybe only 4 or 5 years off if the current rate that we've seen in the last 2 decades holds. And we also know from the climate change work that's been done by many epidemiologists, I think here of the work of my former ANU colleague, Professor Tony McMichael, that probably this is just going to get, we'll see increased incidences of threats to health. So what have been the lessons? Well, I think one really big lesson is that the patent system itself has become a source of pandemic risk. And I'll sort of explain that. But I think unfortunately now we have to not see the patent system as a sort of solution, as it were, to pandemics, but itself a source of pandemic risk. So I'll just quickly run through some of the key messages of my paper, and then perhaps we can talk about some of those questions, those easy questions that Sarah so kindly has thrown my way. So let's kick off with H5N1, which is the avian influenza virus. Now, that really became a threat in the early 2000s. The WHO classified it as a possible pandemic threat. And among other things, the WHO recommended the stockpiling of some prophylactic treatments, antiviral treatments, namely oseltamivir, the brand name for which is Tamiflu, as well as Relenza. Now, Tamiflu was held under by Roche under an exclusive patent license, a license it had obtained from a US pharmaceutical company. Now, as a result of the stockpiling that the WHO recommended, many countries raced to stockpile Tamiflu in particular. Now, with a colleague of mine, a medical doctor, we looked at stockpiles around the world using publicly available data as to the size of those stockpiles. And that resulted in a paper that was published in the Medical Journal of Australia. And in a nutshell, what we found was that in the highest risk countries, China, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, the highest risk countries of where the pandemic was likely to break out, the stockpiles were the lowest. And in the lowest risk countries, Switzerland, the United States, European countries, the stockpiles were the highest. And why was that? Well, for the obvious reason that Roche was charging a monopoly price, was following a profit maximisation strategy. And so only countries that could afford the price could afford anything like the kinds of public stockpiles that were required. So that's what I mean when I say the patent system is a source of risk now, right? Because monopolists typically will follow a profit maximising strategy, and they won't produce in ways that are consistent with managing global public risk. So supplies will not end up in poor countries if it turns out that poor countries are the weak link in a public health strategy. So that's an incredibly important lesson. A second lesson is that pharmaceutical companies lie a lot. And one of the things they lied about was that it was too difficult for other companies to make oseltamivir. And Roche in particular said the process was terribly complex, it couldn't be done by any ordinary company, etc., etc. Well, again, that was sort of proven to be a lot of nonsense. People like Elias Corey, a Harvard chemist, biochemist at Harvard University, for example, showed that it was quite easy to synthesize shikimic acid, which was one of the important ingredients. You could overcome supply problems quite easily through this synthesis. So what that particular incident showed was that open science is actually a much faster way to overcoming supply problems than relying on a monopolist. Okay, so now I want to quickly switch to my second story of patents and pandemics, and that's one that Sarah has already mentioned, the HIV/AIDS story. Now we know that HIV/AIDS kicks off in the 1980s, it becomes identified as a new virus, and then pretty quickly some forms of treatment, some forms of antiviral treatment begin to be discovered, and there's a sort of sense of optimism that, well, perhaps we will be able to deal with this. Unfortunately, with some of the first antiviral treatments, AZT and so on, immunity began to develop very quickly. Very quickly, the virus mutates, and so we had to go back to the drawing board. What emerges in the 1990s are essentially combinations of antiviral treatments, and they prove to be effective. And if you look at the data from the United States, there is a dramatic drop in the death rate from HIV/AIDS. As Sarah points out, however, most of the deaths continue in developing countries, so that of the 20 million deaths that we have by 2000, virtually all of them, the vast majority of them are in developing countries, for the simple reason that, first of all, many of these countries cannot produce antiviral therapies, and secondly, they can't import them because they're far too expensive. I mean, nobody in a developing country could afford the kinds of prices, you know, $10,000, $20,000 back then for a course of antiviral treatments per year. Now, unfortunately, this is where rule complexity meets the sort of physical complexity of the world, because back then, one very important thing happened. The TRIPS agreement comes into operation, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights comes into operation. And that does one really important thing for the pharmaceutical industry. It enacts a product patent rule. So in many countries prior to TRIPS, products were not patentable, right? Pharmaceutical products were not patentable. India being a classic case. Now, the keys to the pharmaceutical kingdom, there are two rules that the industry really care about, right? And there are only two. The rest are kind of good to have, but you must have these two. You have to have a product patent rule, and you have to have patent term extension, right? So, for example, patent term extension rules, when they were enacted in Australia, more or less wiped out the generic industry. The reason being that a whole lot of statin products were about to come off patent. The Australian generic industry was relying on them, on the manufacture of these statins, and then Australia succumbed to bilateral trade pressure, enacted rules around patent term extension, which obviously the pharmaceutical companies took advantage of, and essentially we said goodbye to our generic industry because they had no choice but then to engage in licensing arrangements with Big Pharma, and they were essentially then integrated into Big Pharma's global monopoly structures. Now, TRIPS was the final bit of the puzzle. I'm not going to go into all the other aspects of the how the global patent system works, but I will mention the Patent Cooperation Treaty. One of the last books I wrote, which Sarah correctly did not put up on the screen. It's an extremely boring book. It's about patent offices. And, you know, you would only recommend it to somebody if you had a chronic insomnia problem, or you were interested in the question of how is it that patents, pharmaceutical patents, end up in obscure Pacific islands? Because in writing that book, that's what I discovered. And part of the answer to that is the Patent Cooperation Treaty that enables complex filing routes that allows a pharmaceutical company to essentially cover the world. And as one patent attorney who I interviewed for that project explained to me, Peter, some companies just want total coverage because they just couldn't understand why you'd bother registering pharmaceutical patents in Kiribati, one of the most poorest countries in the world. Just didn't make sense to me. But when he patiently explained it to me, I got it. Now, if we have a look at what TRIPS did, it completely changed the game for the generic industry, and the consequences of that restructuring we will see for a long time to come. The industry is profoundly changing as a result of TRIPS. So in the same way that the physical world adapts, you know, birds adapt, animals adapt, viruses adapt, companies adapt to rule complexity, and that's what the generic industry is doing. It's adapting to the rule complexity that we signed off on back in the 1990s. One of the depressing lessons of that I talk about in my paper is the paragraph 6 system, which is essentially the first TRIPS waiver, which essentially was aimed at allowing the export of HIV/AIDS medicines to countries that were unable to manufacture it. It's too complex a system to describe, but as part of another project that I was involved in, I went to Canada to talk to the Canadian pharmaceutical industry about, among other things, the looming paragraph 6 system and what they thought of it. The only time that system has been used has been by a Canadian company, Apotex. That's the only time this paragraph 6 system has been used. When I spoke to the Canadian generic industry, what they said to me was, hey, Peter, you know, we feel a moral obligation to try and do something. We don't think that the paragraph 6 system is commercially viable. But the reason we're doing this is we just feel some moral obligation to do something because of the incredible number of deaths in developing countries. So as I say, a Canadian generic tried to do something, but the system has essentially not been used, and it just sits there as a kind of symbolic totem, you know, that the pharmaceutical industry points to when they say, oh yeah, there's a system out there. COVID-19. Well, COVID-19 essentially replays much of what we've seen in previous decades. To begin with, many of the technologies related to COVID-19 have already were under patent, you know, have been under patent for a long time. So many virus technologies, many aspects of mRNA technology have been the subject of patents for about at least a decade. Finding out about these patents is incredibly difficult because of the difficulty of patent searching. So when I interview generic companies, or used to, I don't anymore, but in the days that I did, one strategy that they had was that they would always get 2 or 3 searches done by specialist firms in order to ascertain what the patent landscape looked like. And then, they would write to the originator company and they would say, well, we think that this is the patent position, just to see. And of course, the originator company never told them what the patent position was. So in essence, what we have is this very deep and complex legal labyrinth where scientists have to work really, really hard to figure out whether they have the freedom to operate or not. And is that a good use of scientific expertise? Is this how we want our scientists to spend their time? The COVID-19 TRIPS waiver, just like the paragraph 6 system waiver, took a long time to negotiate. I mean, viruses don't sit around waiting for the outcome of international negotiations. They just continue to multiply exponentially. So we kind of have a linear function, which is a trade negotiation of some kind, up against an exponential function. And guess which one wins? So what are my lessons? Well, I think the first lesson I would emphasise is that pharmaceutical companies are not to be trusted. My colleague John Braithwaite wrote a very famous book on crime in the pharmaceutical industry, and he was at the EUI just last week where he gave some public lectures, and one of the things he said in those public lectures is that crime's gotten worse in the pharmaceutical industry since he did that work in the 1980s. And that's actually consistent with the findings of other criminologists. So we have an industry in which there's a high degree of criminality. So that's the first thing. They're untrustworthy. The second thing is that too much really important scientific knowledge is locked up in secrecy, and that's a function of the patent system. Now, you might think that the patent system is there to publicise scientific knowledge. That's the social contract, the patent social contract. In that very boring book I wrote about the system, I argue that the normative justification for patents ultimately resides in a patent social contract, except no one respects the contract, certainly not the pharmaceutical industry. So what we see are extensive use of trade secrets, we see confidentiality agreements, we see non-compete clauses that inhibit scientists from moving around to other jobs. And if you really want to understand how the trade system has elevated trade secrecy, compare the second version of NAFTA, the Trump version, with the first version of NAFTA. The second version of NAFTA has an entire chapter devoted to trade secrets. The really big and depressing lesson, one of the really big and depressing lessons, is that despite the flaws in the system, rich countries will continue to support the patent system. And why? Because it's a rich club. And if you're a member of a rich club, you'll get much better service than the people who are not members of the club. And we saw that with the COVID-19 pandemic. Rich countries got the vaccines. So the reason to support the patent system is because it's a rich club and you will be guaranteed to be at the front of the queue. And if you're poor, you're going to be right at the end of the queue. Another obvious lesson from patents and pandemics is that international negotiations are slow, very slow. I mean, just think, well, most of you probably don't think about the patent system, which is actually probably very good for your mental health. But if you think about the way in which the paragraph 6 system was enacted, it gets talked about for a couple of years, and then in 2003, a waiver is agreed to. And then it takes a while longer for a protocol to be agreed to amend TRIPS. And then by 2017, the protocol comes into operation, you know, it becomes part of the TRIPS agreement. And that's pretty slow going, right? The other big lesson is, of course, and I've already talked about, is that rule complexity is the enemy of public health. Very few of us gain when rule complexity is our way of intervening in physical complexity. It just doesn't work. One of the really important lessons for developing countries from the HIV/AIDS crisis was that those countries that invested in developing their own pharmaceutical capacity did better. So obviously Brazil and Thailand did much better in terms of saving the lives of their population from HIV/AIDS than those countries that were unable to invest in developing their own indigenous pharmaceutical capacity. We also know from 30 years of experience that treaty-based approaches to the sharing of knowledge just don't work. So, and the latest example of that, again, is given to us by COVID, but this is just a historical truth which COVID confirms. The COVID-19 technology access pool simply didn't work. Pharmaceutical companies did not put knowledge into that pool. And I guess the final lesson, and I'm not really sure about this in my own mind, is, are international negotiations really worth it in this area? Should developing countries continue? Because each time they negotiate, they sort of walk away with a worse deal. So what are the options? Well, there are two options as I see it. Option one is the status quo. So developing countries can continue to rely on the West. And what does relying on the West mean exactly? Well, they'll get a bit of state aid, a bit of sort of overseas development assistance. So, you know, the US under its PEPFAR program will purchase HIV/AIDS medicines for developing countries. There'll be a bit of private philanthropy in that. You know, Bill Clinton's Foundation for HIV/AIDS. There'll be a bit of charity in that. You know, Big Pharma will toss a few medicines the way of developing countries. But when it comes to a crisis, developing countries will be at the back of the queue, except for those that have developed indigenous capacity. So that's the status quo. Option two. I think developing countries really have to deepen collaboration amongst themselves. You know, there's a lot of rhetoric about South-South cooperation. Well, the rhetoric has to become real. You really have to do something now to develop scientific ties with other developing countries. You know, there's good science being done in developing countries. You need to deepen that. You need to share that. You need to find ways to intensify it. You also have to find ways of quietly networking with centres of scientific expertise in the West. You know, not every scientist wants to work for Big Pharma. There are some scientists who have different consciences, right? It's all a matter of conscience. Every scientist is going to make a different call. Some will want to go work for Big Tobacco, some will want to go work for Big Pharma, some will want to do something different. It's just the way our world is. Not everybody reasons to a moral obligation in the same way. So some Western scientists will cooperate with people in developing countries. I think the best thing that we can hope for is that we create what I call networks of hope around us, and we activate those, and we do what we can to solve individual problems, whether it's HIV/AIDS, whether it's COVID, whether it's an influenza epidemic, or whatever it is that nature next throws at us. And I think this is a much more realistic strategy than 20 years ago when I was a big advocate for international treaties. You know, I made various proposals at different times. I wrote about an access to knowledge treaty. At one conference I went to, I talked about the need for a treaty on research and development. And while some of those ideas have been picked up, they really haven't gone anywhere. And so what I would say to my younger self is that the treaty-based path is too geopolitically compromised. And what needs to happen is sort of quiet behind the scenes work where people of conscience get together and see what they can do to solve a problem. That's probably the best bet. And to build those networks, and maybe those networks will scale in ways that will surprise us. We just don't know. So on that note, I think I'll call it a day.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that talk and for those interesting insights into potential paths forward and I guess pitfalls when it comes to providing vaccines and pandemic technologies around the world. We have about 10 or 13 minutes left. If there are any questions that anybody would like to ask, I've got my eye on the chat for students who are participating in the live stream. I've also somewhat got my eye on the chat for the Zoom, but not as much. My Zoom setup is slightly tricky right now, but I'll try and open that up. And in the meantime, is there anyone from Global Nexus here at McMaster who would like to ask a question or make a comment in response to Professor Drahos's talk?
So Sarah, if you don't mind, I'll start off. Peter,
Yeah.
Thank you for a really thoughtful discussion and really got me thinking about things in a really different way. I guess one of the questions I would ask you is, what is one of the arguments has always been that there is the need for this is intellectual property protection like this is speed. That is, you can move quite fast because these things belong to you. Even in a pandemic, you think that that's an argument that is actually useful, or is that spurious?
I think it's spurious. I'm hoping that governments by now will have worked out that they really need to be ready for the next pandemic, because I think the next one is not a long way away. I mean, I think experts have been warning about the threat of pandemics for a long time now. And so I'm hoping that governments will be much more ready to invest than they have in the past. I don't, I mean, do we need the patent system to speed this up? Yeah. The problem is that even if you accept the argument that we need the patent system, the way in which the patent system distributes vaccines is not quick enough for developing countries. So if you're a $20 trillion economy like the United States, and you've got an awful lot of venture capital floating around, sure, you can use the patent system and unbelievably generous terms to mobilize the private sector into action. But the United States is almost sui generis, right? There aren't too many other $20 trillion economies in the world. And if you have a look at the way in which vaccines were distributed, while the system worked for the United States, arguably, and perhaps Europe, it arguably did not work for pretty much, the other 160 countries that didn't get vaccines in time. So one of the big questions is, what system will deliver speed for developing countries in ways that are affordable? Because what exactly it's a little consolation to people in developing countries to be told, well, if you've got a $20 trillion economy, the patent system works just great.
Peter, I saw in the chat that one person was asking you to elaborate on networks of hope, and someone else has just asked as well about the potentials of, I guess, open patenting approaches to dealing with these technologies.
Yeah, so I think a really big question is to what extent universities participate in the patent system at all. I mean, so my view roughly is that universities should stick to foundational work, whether it's on viruses and so on, and that universities themselves should really reach out and build trust with other communities of scientists. And I think of the work of a scientist at the Australian National University, a guy called Graham Laver, who did extremely important work on the influenza virus for many decades. He was one of the first scientists that went to China. And this goes to my networks of hope analysis. And, you know, he was welcomed with open arms in China. He was a bit worried about going to China because, you know, his hypothesis was that the influenza virus and pandemics would have many origins there would be an origin story to tell there in China. And the Chinese scientists there welcomed him with open arms. And they also gave him actually samples of viruses that turned out to be very important and that Labour then shared with the community of scientists working on influenza through the mechanism of the World Health Organization. So when I say networks of hope and what universities should be doing, is that universities need to stick to what universities know how to do, which is public research. And you know, that's what we created universities for. We didn't create them to be private arms of corporations. We created them as public goods for the public interest. And so, in my view, networks of hope have to be anchored in universities. They have to, and those universities have to create bridges of trust with other communities of scientists, because otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. And you know, the idea that somehow, you know, the COVID-19 vaccine was the work of, you know, one or two people. I mean, it was the work of many networked scientists across generations and across space and time. So unless universities stick to their mandate in that way, I worry. Now, sure, if a university is going to go down the path of patents, fine, open licensing, but you know that sort of comes with its own problems. But you know, better a world in which you have open, non-exclusive licenses than a world in which you pursue some commercial strategy.
Thanks so much, Peter. I'll ask Anthony, who I see has their hand up, and then after that I'll ask if there's any students in the room or on the chat who have a question or a comment as well.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Peter. Just a quick question. I guess we identified a lot that in your talk that paragraph 6 in the Doha Declaration is really the source of a lot of the problem, in addition to the patent regime. I'm curious whether you feel that there is some hope that a partial solution might be found in TRIPS itself, particularly Article 66.2, which is about technology transfer obligations, and the sort of lack of clarity around what that means in terms of the benefit potentially to developed states and being able to receive, the benefit of technologies that could help with the production of vaccines. Do you have any thoughts to, I guess, whether there is a release valve within TRIPS that could ameliorate the shortcomings of paragraph 6?
Well, the answer is no, I don't. And I think what that doesn't recognise, Anthony, is the geopolitical economy of patents. I mean, paragraph 6 ultimately is a restrictive reading of what would have been possible maybe under TRIPS Article 30, where you could have had a much more bottom-up approach with states essentially taking different approaches to limiting patent exclusivity. And paragraph 6 is an essentially unworkable commercial mechanism. And And then the current TRIPS waiver doesn't do anything to improve paragraph 6. It's even worse on my reading than the paragraph 6 system. And as I said to you, I'm not aware of any successful models of technology transfer that have been treaty-based. I'm just not. I think Article 66.2 will ultimately sit there as a sort of symbolic, have primarily a symbolic role. So I think the answer does not lie in treaty games, because you're always going to be outgunned by the pharmaceutical industry and by the United States and the EU that will support the pharmaceutical industry. So if I look at the history of the negotiations, they've gone from bad to worse. So no, I'm not at all optimistic about TRIPS or Article 66.2.
Are there any students in the chat on the live stream or in the room who have any questions or comments?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That was fascinating and I guess depressing, but maybe not surprising. What is the most radical option? I was, as a non-patent expert, a non-pandemic expert, I was hoping that a developing country like South Africa would simply start producing vaccines that would defy pharmaceutical companies and invite them to respond, but say, this is the public interest. What maybe is the most radical response you can advise?
Well, radical responses have been tried. So here are a couple of examples. Indonesia, during the threat of the avian influenza pandemic, refused to give the WHO viruses, right? So there's a virus exchange program run by the WHO, and Indonesia said, well, we're not going to participate until we get some sort of benefit out of the exchange. But that's not a really good radical approach. It's a bit like, some movie I once saw in which a cowboy, some comedy, Blazing Saddles, that's right, in which one of the guys threatens somebody else by holding a gun to his own head, right? It's a sort of comedy, but it's a sort of dumb thing, right? We're going to threaten you by withholding viruses, which ultimately, we're a community of shared fate in all of this. So that kind of radical approach by Indonesia probably is sort of suboptimal, as it were. I mean, the problem for South Africa was that it just can't produce. Many developing countries cannot produce, and unfortunately, it takes a lot to build up a pharmaceutical industry. And the countries that did it before TRIPS, Brazil and India, have managed to hang on to that industry. Trying to do it in a TRIPS environment now is incredibly difficult. And the other problem for South Africa is that, the United States has given South Africa $8 billion worth of HIV/AIDS treatments. Well, that really knocks your capacity to develop an indigenous pharmaceutical industry, right? If you're receiving that amount of aid, right? So aid from the West is a double-edged sword. So I think the radical solutions lie in ultimately the conscience of scientists, in the development of these networks, and in the building of a system. I also think universities have a real moral responsibility here. I'm sick of the fact that they have become corporate arms of big pharma or big tobacco or big oil. Universities, if they wanted to, could do some radical things, right? So here's one idea. Every university in Canada or Australia could get up and say, right, from now on, we're going to take out patents, and those patents are available free to use for anybody anywhere in the world, as long as they're used in good faith. And that's exactly what Elon Musk has done with Tesla, right? He just got up and said, hey, the real enemy here is not, or the real competitors here are not other electric car manufacturers. It's the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel cars. So he said, let's club together. And he said Tesla's position on patent licensing is, right, as long as you use our patents in good faith, they're free to use. And essentially what that means is that everybody now has an incentive to use those patents and develop them as essentially free forms of knowledge. Now, if universities, instead of hanging on to their grubby little patent portfolios, did exactly the same, that would be a radical thing to do. Make life much harder for Big Pharma, because there'd be no exclusivity anymore. Any Indian manufacturer, any Argentinian manufacturer, any Brazilian manufacturer could make use of that. So there are some big ideas that one could put forward, but they rely ultimately on moral courage. And how much of that do we have?
Peter, thank you so much today for your talk. It's been so interesting to take this walk through patent and pandemic history, and to learn some of the lessons of, I guess, the failures of the past, and potential networks of hope and strategies of hope that you always strive to produce in your work. It's such a pleasure to see you and to have you here at McMaster. And thanks as well to all of the other attendees and participants and students who came to today's talk. Thank you so much to everyone, to Jerry, and to all the others who participated today. It's wonderful to be together this way.
Okay, thanks, Sarah, for all of that. It was great seeing everybody and seeing so many faces I recognise. So I enjoyed it.